folks? Well, it's that time of year again. Halloween is at our doorsteps. So I thought I'd go ahead and give you a little treat for your trick, and a little special something for this special time of year. So lock your doors, shut the windows, draw the shades, light a candle or two, and throw another log on the fire. 'Cause tonight, it's storytelling time. Other than a handful of friends and family, I haven't shared this story until now. This is by far the most unnerving experience I've ever had, and it's been with me ever since it happened, back in 2011. Currently, I live in New York City, and my good friend at the time was from Maryland. We decided to take a trip down there to visit his family, hang out, and do a little camping. The winter weather had already moved on, and the beautiful spring weather was already in full swing. We arrived at the campsite at Elk Neck State Park, about a half a mile from a small lake in the park in a heavily wooded area, and about 50 feet above sea level. After we set up the tent, we fired up the grill and threw a few chicken breasts on there for dinner. We fed the beast of an appetite we both had, and by this point, the sun had already dropped below the horizon. We were having a nice, genuine camping experience, but that wouldn't last. About an hour after dinner, my buddy's demeanor changed, and I could tell he wasn't feeling too good. He began complaining of both stomach and headache problems. Once he retreated to his tent, I had an itch to go on a walk and clear my mind under the beauty of a crystal clear night sky. So I grabbed my flashlight and began heading down the path that leads down to the small lake I mentioned earlier. I could tell it had been some time since anybody conducted any servicing or maintenance on the trail, as most of it was overgrown and easy to veer off, which I did a few times but eventually got back on. On a side note, I'm really invested in the art of meditation, and as I continued down the path, I came across a slight clearing with a fallen tree in the center of it. I figured it'd be a great little spot to hunker down for a few minutes and meditate. As I sat there, taking it all in, the sound of the light breeze through the trees, the feel of a warm spring draft, and a surprisingly good view of the lake below, I began to notice a change of energy. My meditation was disrupted by pure silence and stillness, and I felt a strange presence in the area. I opened my eyes only to come face to face with what I can only describe as a glowing, white blob about the size of a grown man, floating right in front of me. But I wasn't afraid, as it seemed benevolent, and almost felt comforting to know it was there with me and that I wasn't completely alone out there. I know, kind of a strange reaction to an odd situation to begin with like this, but then it changed positions and glided over to my left side, where it stayed there for several minutes, just hovering. I continued to stare at it. Well, what happened next is beyond any explanation, and also would be the scariest moment of my life. Right before my eyes, the blob just vanished, and all the good vibes I was feeling went with it. It felt like I was protected, and now I wasn't. And off in the distance, maybe about a half a mile to a mile closer to the lake, I hear the most blood-curdling and loudest noise I've ever heard to this day. It kinda sounded like a fox cry, but even louder and more mangled and monstrous. I had a sinking feeling and started to get visual impressions of an actual monster racing towards me. Pure fear started pumping through my veins. As soon as this thought entered my head that this was not a good place to be, I hear whatever it was barreling through the woods, and this thing was huge. The woods were silent, and all I could hear was this thing coming my way, tearing through the brush as it went, moving quite fast. I was frozen in fear, but in that moment I knew if I didn't run for my life, I would be dead. It was maybe 10 yards from me at this point, behind a thick line of brush, and I can see and hear this whole tree and bush shaking right in front of me. I ran back towards the way I came, screaming my friend's name as I went. I felt that whatever it was coming right after me, and in that moment, felt the most primal fear I've ever felt to this day. I break out of the tree line thankfully, and I'm on the campsite service road, and I knew I was safe as soon as I made it to that road. I booked it back to our tent, tore it open, and my friend bolted upright, and immediately he asked me, "What the hell happened?" All I could say was, "Did you hear it?" He confirmed that he heard something and that it kind of freaked him out, and they had never heard something quite like that before. He had walked out of his tent to check on the fire, wondering where I was, heard the scream, then bolted into the tent again. He had also heard me screaming his name, but he said he yelled back at me, but for whatever reason I couldn't hear him. After hyping ourselves up for a few minutes, I told him we should go back out together to see if this thing was still there. This is past midnight at this point. I take him on the exact route I took, through the trail and off of it, until we get to the big fallen tree. As we're looking around, the same bush and tree 10 yards away starts shaking violently again, and we bolted right back to the tent, but somehow managed to go to sleep a couple hours later, surprisingly. The next morning, even though the forecast was clear mid-50s and sunny, the entire area was under a dense blanket of fog, and we woke up to heavy rain on our tent. And it was cold rain, maybe mid-40s. We planned on staying another night, but conditions were terrible, so we packed up and drove back to civilization. To this day, I have no idea what happened out there. The Maryland coast doesn't seem like a cluster area, nor is it known for any paranormal or Bigfoot activity. So the whole thing is still a mystery to this day, and whatever it was that had chased me, I guess I'll never know. It could have just been a huge territorial badger or something. But still, the weather changes, the energy, the blob, everything. Definitely not my idea of normal. The most unsettling night I recall was a September night on top of Humpback Mountain near Rockfish Gap in Virginia. The fog was about the thickest I'd ever seen it during the day, and it only got thicker at night. Sounds were muted, and it was a very peaceful, ethereal kind of day for hiking. I usually prefer the company of fog when I'm hiking anyway. That night about 11 p.m., I started hearing children's laughter off in the distance, fading in and out, but gradually coming up the mountain. Not following the course of a trail, but coming straight up the sides where there was no trail. I can make out 3 distinct children's voices, and 1 adult female's voice. Eventually, it sounded as they were passing right through my campsite, and should have been close enough to see. And all I could hear was laughter right up close, and the occasional mumbled word, but I couldn't make out what they were saying exactly. The sound stopped abruptly soon after it got close, and didn't start back up again. It was like it ended as soon as it got through my camp. I often wonder if it was just a strange acoustical phenomena due to the fog, but I can't explain how the voices got closer, or why they stopped, or why a woman and 3 children would be playing loudly outside on a cold, dark, intensely foggy autumn night. This story occurred in the summer of 2008. I grew up in Oregon and was acquainted with the outdoors from an early age. My favorite hobby came to be hiking, particularly in areas that are either very dangerous or isolated. The health benefits of hiking were secondary to the thrills of walking the edges of exposed cliffs, being in cougar and bear territory, and knowing that I was far from help. The movie Into the Wild was released in the fall of 2007, and I immediately fell in love with it. Being a high school senior, I could barely go another week living in my parents' house. The movie spoke to my sense of adventure and inspired me to hike the California portion of the Pacific Crest Trail upon graduation, and so I did. I made it from the Mexico border to Northern California without much incident. I saw rattlesnakes and black bears, experienced dehydration, but nothing happened that made me fear for my life. Somewhere in the Lassen National Forest in northeastern California, I walked around a bend in a trail, only to be startled by two people sitting on a rock, dressed in nearly all white. Their faces were dirty, their appearance disheveled, and the man had a long, unkempt beard. Both seemed to be in their 40s. What struck me out about this encounter was encountering anybody at all. I frequently went days without seeing a single human being. Their white clothes could be explained away by the need to escape the California summer sun. Their scruffy appearance could be explained away by the fact that most thru hikers abandon personal hygiene on the trail. After I said hello, they said nothing and simply watched me as I passed by. Even that I didn't find odd. I chalked it up to them being foreign and not knowing what to say. I camped a few hundred yards off the trail that night, as I always did, following bare precautions. I hung the leftover food I had cooked that night from a tree approximately 5 feet off the ground. Packing up camp in the morning, I noticed the food wasn't there. I immediately thought a bear had entered my campsite, and so I began to look for paw prints. But I didn't find any. Instead, I did find boot prints circling the campsite, 2 pairs of them. One of those prints led right up to the rope from which the food was hanging. I thought of the couple I'd passed earlier, and everything clicked. I quickly packed up and left. Who knows what these two were capable of? I didn't want to find out. My mind was racing the entire day, but I'd figured the couple was simply hungry. If they had negative intentions, they would have come for more than just food, I'm sure. Several days passed, and my mind was at ease again. I had begun to circle my campsite with sticks to wake me up in the event of another intruder, animal or otherwise. I awoke in my tent one night to the sound of those sticks crunching, so I grabbed my hunting knife. I tried to relax by telling myself that in the middle of nowhere, the source of that noise is much more likely an animal than a person. But then I heard frantic whispering. It wasn't possible to tell which direction the voices were coming from. Being in the dark, surrounded by trees, 100 miles from the nearest city plays tricks on your senses. I debated yelling out, claiming to have a gun, but instead decided to be quiet and retain the benefits of surprise. I heard the footsteps circling my tent and was ready to slash at whatever opened it. I heard the footsteps slowly circling my tent, and I was ready to slash. But just like that, it was over. No more footsteps. No more whispering. I lied frozen awake in my tent until sunrise, and opened my tent in the morning to find nobody there. The only evidence I can find that something had actually been out there were the boot prints again, the same as before. Several more days passed and I was now in Shasta National Forest. probably 50 to 75 miles from where I first encountered the couple. The trail became more or less than the goat trail. Being on the side of a mountain and above the tree line, I could see the trail winding for miles in front and behind me. I stopped for water in the rare shade and noticed two hikers just miles behind me. All I could see were two white dots moving along the mountainside. I immediately said to myself, "Screw this, this trip is over." I pulled out my map and looked for the nearest town, which appeared to be Costilla, located off I-5. The only problem was that it was 25 miles away. I hiked well into the night, trying to gain as much ground as possible. I kept losing the trail and decided to set up camp, this time far off the trail and into the forest. I got in my tent and tried to sleep, but every little noise kept me awake. After a few hours in my tent, I heard the telltale signs of another bad night. The footsteps, the whispering, the sticks breaking. Sound travels far in the absence of another sound. I knew they were close, but wasn't sure how close. All I could think was, this is messed up. This is so messed up. Finally, flashlights hit my tent, lights up the entire thing and goes dark. I unzipped my tent and climbed out carrying my knife, yelling nonsense into the dark. It was sort of like that cliché sense in movies where people in the wilderness hear sticks breaking around them and the camera pans around the trees because the people have no idea which direction the sound is coming from. And then I heard footsteps running towards the tent and barely made out a figure moving in my peripheral vision. I turned and ran deep into the forest. I must have tripped a few times and ran into several trees. And after running approximately 5 minutes, I stopped and rested next to a downed tree. I got under the tree trunk and laid still. I saw the flashlight moving around in the distance. But I laid under that tree for hours, and I was certain they were gone, but I still didn't want to move. Eventually, the sounds of morning came to life. Birds started chirping, and I knew the sunrise would come soon. Once it did, I made my way back to the trail and walked the rest of the distance to Costilla, where the Pacific Crest Trail crosses I-5. I hitchhiked my way down to the town of Mount Shasta and spoke with the police and the Forest Service. They put me up in a motel for the night, and my parents drove from Oregon to pick me up the next day. I followed up with the police and Forest Service months later, who told me there had been similar reports of items disappearing from campsites throughout the surrounding national forests. However, there had been no other reports of the terror that I had experienced, and as far as I know, nothing ever came of the couple.
And there you have it. Just a few more downright spooky wilderness stories to add to your night. Thanks for listening, and stay tuned for new videos coming your way in the near future. Have yourselves a fine Halloween, everyone.